Well, I think it's about damn time that we're talking about UFOs in the whatever you want to call it, mainstream media, the established media, whatever. It it, but we still have a problem. I just saw an article or a story yesterday from NPR where they brought on two skeptics to discuss uh, the three Navy videos, and the headline was about little green men. So people are still screwing this up, but am I heartened by the change? Absolutely. There's more people in across the spectrum of media taking it seriously now, and that's really good news. It's necessary, and I'm happy to see it happen. Clearly, from my own experience in the news, which was literally decades ago, I would say if I had pitched UFOs to an assignment editor when I was a correspondent at CNN, I doubt very much that they would have been very interested in sending me out to cover anything. And as a general assignment reporter at a couple of local stations and an anchorman, I don't think we would have covered too many things unless it literally flew over the football stadium during a game. Maybe we would have covered that. And if I'd read a story as an anchorman on one of the nightly newscasts or tied in with the weather or anything like that, I think it would have degenerated into smirks and smiles. So I think we are making progress. The fact that the DoD and the U.S. Navy have at least acknowledged those three videos opens the door to a much grander discussion of this whole wide phenomena.
Right. So you mentioned an assignment editor back at CNN or PBS or really any media publication would have been very reluctant to let you pursue a story like this back then. But yet there is such interest from the public in the topic. For example, when the Times broke the story in 2017 about ATIP, these three videos were some of the most viewed they had ever put out. So there's a lot of demand for this type of information. Why do you think the reluctance is there from a publishing standpoint? Is it just that the stigma has never really been able to be lifted?
You'd have to get into some deep psychology to kind of figure out exactly what the underlying essence of it is. But there has been what I would call stigma, as you called it, stigma, put on it, because I think if you go back to, say, the late 40s, after the Roswell crash and after the beginning of the Kenneth Arnold sightings, you would have realized that a lot of you know, there was what I call the two pillars that they put in place after Roswell, which was denial and ridicule. All right. Uh, Deny, deny, deny. And then if that doesn't work, make fun, ridicule. And I would have, if I was a betting man, or you were a betting man, and we could have that bet, I would bet that the people who were in charge of managing the secret post Roswell probably would have thought this could have gone on for about 5 years. And I think the people who really put in place the secrecy policy that's been in effect since the 40s and before, they would be shocked that it has been so durable. It has been so significant that it isn't even that the government or anyone else has to actively try to manipulate us into not taking UFOs seriously. We do the work for them. I mean, I've said for years that when I've I've produced a lot of, I produced the television series Dark Skies about UFOs. And so I'd go to a lot of parties or neighborhood barbecues, and people would say, "So what do you really know about UFOs?" And I would start talking about UFOs. And the way I've expressed it over the years is I was kind of treated like the drunk uncle at the wedding, right? Well, don't talk to Bryce unless you want to get into that stuff. And so that wasn't the government telling anyone not to take it seriously. That was people knowing that. So I think there is something deep seated that some of us are willing to talk about it on a more effective level, and we are not there yet with the sufficient majority of the population, but we are getting there. There are more people today willing to discuss this seriously than there were a few years ago, and there are certainly a lot more today than there were back in the 50s and 60s.
Right. And you mentioned those sightings from all the way back to the 40s.
Yeah.
And if those have happened, they've been well documented ever since. Why do you think it's taken until now And why do you think it was those three videos in particular that made their way out from the DoD? Because we speculate that there's a lot more
Oh,
video footage, radar footage, amongst other data that could be analyzed, and yet it hasn't come forward.
well, I've said for years that the government certainly has better video than we do. We have our cell phones now, and we're out there trying to take pictures, but they've got gun camera footage. But the problem is, historically, when they've gotten the good gun camera footage, they lock it up, and I don't know where they take it, but they certainly haven't publicized it. It hasn't been given to the evening news. And there is something that I think is very odd. If you look at the coverage now, the media overall, not all of them, but overall, the media tends to look at this like there's just been these three videos, that there was no discussion of UFOs ever in history until the New York Times in 2017 published that article and talked about those videos. And so people are now saying, well, those videos, they could represent something else. Maybe China or Russia has hop-skipped over us in the technology front, because they're looking at only three videos. But the truth is, those videos should be the doorway to the larger context of hundreds of excellent cases and thousands of pretty good cases that have existed worldwide, going back to mostly the 40s onward. And one of the you mentioned that I had co-written AD After Disclosure with Richard Dolan, and one of the ways we met is I had read his earlier books, UFOs and the National Security State, and he did 2 parts on it. And I had called him and said, "These are really brilliant books, and do you want to collaborate on something?" And we did. But for people that want the context, that want to understand that this didn't start in 2017, I urge them to, again, there's lots of good books, and I'm not trying to sell books for Richard other than to say he's a brilliant historian of this. They're called UFOs and the National Security State, and they sort of walk you chronologically through these incredible amounts of sightings. And you get to the place where you say, okay, if people in 2020 are now debating whether those videos that the Navy has acknowledged are the real thing, if we're now debating, my God, we don't have the technology that could equal what these things do in these videos. Well, for crying out loud, if we don't have it in 2020, I guarantee you we didn't have it in 1947 onward. And in the 40s and 50s, nobody on Earth, Americans or Soviets or Chinese or anybody, had that kind of technology that were at least Earth-based people. So I think that you've got to look at some extraordinary possibilities. And that's why I say, I urge my friends who want to talk authoritatively about this to get a little more context under their belt and not just discuss the Navy videos. Use those as the springboard to the larger issue.
Right. If people want to look beyond those 3 videos and they want to find other credible cases, I think a lot of people take those 3 seriously because the Navy officially took that position and the DoD officially said they are UAP. The New York Times has its own authority. So there's a certain lens of credibility that maybe people view them through. What other events, if any, would you point to that maybe have similar elements, do have, are well documented, whether it's photographic evidence or video evidence or just other pilot reports? You mentioned the Roswell event. Are there others that people should take more seriously?
Of course, and there's many there. I mean, there's so many. It's a cornucopia of great possibilities. What I urge people to do that want to speak authoritatively is to pick 1 or 2 of these events and do a deep dive into them so that you can tell more than just the surface. But just a quick few hits. Obviously, the Chicago O'Hare sighting in 2006 is a terrific one. The 1976 Iranian sightings are well documented by us and the Iranians. And there's many of those. The Belgium flying triangles of the late 80s, great ones. And another great book, just to tip of the hat to, would be Leslie Kane's book. Takes about 6 of these and does a deep dive in them. It's very helpful and useful. And so those are sort of some of the touchstones that you'd want to go with, but there's so many that just that are really great cases documented by radar and police officers, et cetera, that really don't get any sway right now. One of the joys of producing the Dark Skies television series, and again, this was not a documentary series, it was a drama series. It was set in the 1960s, and it told the story of a young, naive, optimistic, congressional intern, basically, a guy named John Loengard, who goes to DC to be part of John Kennedy's New Frontier and ends up getting sucked into Majestic 12, which is the UFO organization designed to manage this secret. And one of the great joys of Dark Skies, every episode, we did a little blend between a UFO story from history and the moments of history. So we would blend them together. So, for example, the New York City power blackout of 1965 is a well-known and well-recorded event, but it coincided with numerous UFO sightings at the same time. And people don't really talk about that. Certainly the mainstream has never covered the blackout as if it might have anything to do with UFOs. So it was kind of nice to do that. And I think people that actually do some research and actually start reading are amply rewarded these days. Now, I'm not saying, I am not saying at all, I believe everything I read. You'd be a foolish person, let alone a journalist. I mean, I've won investigative reporting awards, and I didn't do it by believing everything everybody told me. So there is a lot of nonsense out there right now today, and you can find a lot of it. And I wish it didn't exist. I wish people wouldn't make things up. I wish people wouldn't exaggerate, because we're at a really pivotal time in human history where we need to get on with this. And the way to get on with it is not to entertain all the charlatans and crazies who are attracted to the UFO thing like a moth is to light. Instead, we have to focus on the credible sources, the credible historians, the credible voices out there. Listen to them and do a little of your own research, and you will be rewarded. And I guarantee you, if you go into that tunnel where you say, you know what, in the next year, I'm going to read a dozen good quality books on this topic. By the time you get out of that year, if you don't think something's going on, you obviously didn't read them very well with much attention, because something is, as we said in the series, we used the Buffalo Springfield song, and we said something's happening here. What it is ain't exactly clear, and that's how I feel about it.
Are you of the position that there are people in our country, perhaps even in our government, that do know what's going on, really know what's going on, what these UAP are? Or do you think that it's possible that, I think Harry Reid's even suggested that maybe nobody knows, and that's sad because, you know, there are answers out there?
Well, let's break that down a little bit. Do I think that there are people who know, and by know, I would say that is, they know exactly what they are, why they're here, and what they're doing? No, I don't necessarily believe that exists. But for example, you and myself and all lots of other people who have looked into this, we're guessing about what a lot of the evidence is. And we aren't able to fill in the gaps. But there has been an ongoing government and global investigation to this phenomenon since the 40s and maybe before. And I do think that some people know a lot more than I know. I mean, I know what I know, but I also know what I don't know. And I think that there are some people out there, I would call them the managers. I don't know what the group is called. I don't know that they're in government anymore exactly. I don't know that they're all men. I don't know that they all wear hats. I don't know that they wear black. But I know that there's a group of people out there. And maybe it's a mix of private enterprise and government. It's hard to say. That part is speculative. But there are people who have studied it and written reports long before these, you know, the ATIP kind of stories that we're getting, which are great. And Lou Elizondo, I'm glad to have him out there and everything. But these reports have been getting written since the 40s. I mean, so, and the U.S. government, from the reports that I've read that are declassified, about studying UFOs, clearly was trying desperately to learn a lot fast. So if um, if there is going to be a wholesale disclosure someday, there's going to be a lot of great reading from reports from the 40s and the 50s and the 60s that will shed a lot of light on this. So roundabout, to answer your question, I would assume there is a group of interested parties, managers, who have taken part in this over the years. And I'm not sure exactly what has happened to lead to the relative success of the secrecy. Um, but if there was ever a time where it's time to look to the future, it's now. That's why, I have a Twitter feed about this topic called Hollywood UFOs. But that's the tag for it. But I call it People Get Ready, because I think, and I'm not the young man I used to be. I'm not as young as you are, and I wish I was. But I would like to know what's going on to a better degree than I do now before I shuffle off this earth. And I get the sense that we're closer now than we have in a long time. But I will say this: I've collected UFO books all my life. I have a giant shelf full of them. And if you go when I was doing Dark Skies, every book I read, I would put on the side of it the year that it was written and arrange them in that order. And as I read through them chronologically, you realize that people have been predicting ultimate disclosure from the beginning, and they always think it's imminent. So I don't want to fall in that trap where I'm saying, yep, it's just around the corner, because I have a friend who predicts it's going to happen every year, and he's always wrong, right? But someday, by predicting it's going to happen every year, he'll be right. I just happen to think that if you look at the political situation and the opening of these Navy videos, here's the difference. The difference is that now you could make the argument, though, you could say, well, I don't know if they're UFOs in that they're extraterrestrial, but they certainly are unidentified, and they certainly are flying objects, or you could call them UAP, they're unidentified aerial phenomena. So you could make the argument that the Navy has confirmed to us, and so is the Department of Defense, that there are things flying around the skies that aren't ours and probably don't belong to the Russians or the Chinese. So then you'd have to ask yourself, well, who do they belong to? And that is where it gets interesting. These objects are unidentified, and there are numerous credible cases where people who have access to our nuclear weapons have cited them and have noticed impacts by these objects on nuclear weapons. Now, these people were trusted to watch nuclear weapons for the United States, which is a pretty big responsibility. So if we're going to say they're not good witnesses, I find that hard to believe. So I think the entry for us right now, the entry to get this thing discussed in a rational way, is to use the idea that these objects have been cited in proximity to nuclear battle groups and nuclear missile silos. And as a consequence, you could make the argument that, okay, maybe you don't want to have public hearings right now, but you sure as hell better get to work and have some private hearings and eventually tell the public what you found, because that doesn't sound like a safe situation to me. That sounds like something where the public does indeed have a right to know.
Right. I want to ask you about the nuclear facility proximity relationship and the battle groups as well. There's not to dwell too much on those three videos, but one of them came from the 2004 Nimitz incident. Again, a nuclear strike group preparing, doing simulated training exercises for a deployment, but really going off to the Iraq war. So significant historic event before these guys are going off.
Sure.
They encounter these things on video, on radar, eyewitnesses. Wanted to ask you what you make of that event, and if it's consistent with, some of the other more historic events you've talked about.
Well, I don't pretend to be an expert on the Nimitz event or the underlying details of all of these. I've read about them, and I've done a deep dive in that regard, but I'm not the world's best guy to discuss the nuance of them. But I will say this, having investigated them, having listened to firsthand witnesses discuss them, and sort of, done my due diligence to there, and now, of course, being confirmed by the Navy, it seems like something happened that wasn't normal, and it freaked out a lot of people, as it should. And I look at it as a seminal event. So I think when the history of the UFO cover-up and the subsequent disclosure is written, it will be a pivotal point in that history. When Dolan and I were writing our book and we decided to call it AD for after disclosure, we did so because we said, look, the disclosure of this reality is the biggest event in human history. It's actually bigger than Jesus, if, not to get in trouble on that regard, but it's such a big event that it is a dividing line. And if the birth of Jesus was a dividing line in a calendar, well, then we thought the calendar would be divided again by the knowledge that we're not alone. So I think we are in the final days of what I would call BC, which is before confirmation. And we're moving into AD, which is after disclosure. And, here in Hollywood, you can either have a slow dissolve or a hard cut. I don't think it's going to be a hard cut. Although I've thought about that, but that would be the president or the Pope or the Chinese premier, or somebody goes to a podium and says UFOs are real, get with the program. That's a hard cut. I think we're witnessing a slow dissolve. And for reasons that I'm not entirely clear on, it seems that there are elements within the U.S. forces who wish to start this dialogue on a more serious basis, or else they wouldn't have let these videos out in the first place, and they wouldn't have confirmed them. So, which is a long answer and not specific to what you ask about the Nimitz, but the Nimitz strikes me as a very, very fine case, and I urge anyone to dive into that one and learn a little more.
You answered it perfectly, and you nailed it. That I think it touches on that cover up, because all the Princeton crew and the Nimitz crew all reported that these guys landed. Some of them were in regular clothes, plain clothes. Some of them were in Air Force uniform, and they clearly remember the Air Force insignia on their uniform.
Yes.
Landed, took all the data, all the hard drives from the ships, from the E-2 Hawkeye, which had a close encounter with the Tic Tac. There was apparently a longer form video that the pilot that actually captured that FLIR video after Commander Fravor,
right,
Commander Underwood, he went up and captured that video. There was a longer video. They took that apparently. So a lot of this information went somewhere, and that's the most frustrating part about all of this. It's that there is a lot of data somewhere, and somebody had access.
That you just hit the nail there with the word frustration. It is frustrating so badly because clearly these little video vignettes that we got, and that's all they can really be called. They're just little slices of what has to be a longer video. I mean, let's face it, they were turned on and loaded and shooting and recording for a lot longer than the videos we got. So therefore, there's a longer video. And then the question becomes, is there a better video? Is there a higher quality resolution video? And I would guess pretty good chance there is. But clearly, there's been the U.S. Air Force, and it isn't just the U.S. Air Force. Roll in Chile, roll in Argentina and South America and France and the Soviet Union and China and the UK. All of these countries have had air forces that have encountered UFOs repeatedly over the years, and they have all tried to take pictures and videos of them or film of them over the years. So it gets really curious. What these things represent must be so astonishing in the meaning that they bring to our society, that these countries, which frankly can't get along most of the time and can't agree on anything almost never, have all agreed in lockstep to not talk about this in a substantial way over the years. Now you could say, well, look, you know, France had that study, the Cometa study released in 99, but that was, again, they maintained a little distance from the thing. Nobody has come out and said, yep, we got the pictures. You want to look at them? But they do have these pictures. These things have happened and they've watched them. So this is the part that chills me a little bit, because listen, I want to know before I'm gone, but I make I I think that it is a complex thing that we are in the middle of, and it challenges possibly the very nature of reality. And so, yeah, I I always quote General Buck Turgidson from the uh, the film Dr. Strangelove, and he was talking about nuclear war, but I think it fits for UFOs. And he says, "I'm not saying we're not going to get our hair mussed," and that's kind of how I look at it. It could be a wild ride that we're in for, but it's about to happen.
So before we got on the stream, we talked about you. I think you have a yellow submarine behind you.
Right.
John Lennon, I believe, had a quote about UFOs and maybe even an encounter with one. And
Yes.
I saw something about that on your website. Do you mind talking at all about
Yeah, I am a Beatles fan. Wrote a book about the Beatles, a what if book. You know, what if they had stayed together, which is more appropriate now than ever, because the Beatles broke up, you know, in 1970, and we're experiencing the anniversary of that. So I've been interested in it, but it's interesting because my two of my sort of cultural passions, UFOs and the Beatles, do cross with John Lennon in I think it's 1974 in August, and he's not living with Yoko. He's in his New York apartment with May Pang, his girlfriend at the time, and he sees a UFO that he described as sort of looking like a top. I mean, a colorful top. And he and May Pang literally stood on their balcony and watched this thing for a number of minutes, and before it left. Now, and the problem is that has not been considered a great sighting, I guess, because John Lennon did a lot of drugs, and at the time he saw the UFO, he was stark naked, I guess. So it sort of makes for that denial and ridicule thing to take it away. But he certainly seemed very credible when he discussed it. He didn't sound like he was trying to have one on somebody. He described it very realistically. But what I've always loved about John Lennon, I wish I had the quote in front of me right now, because I've published it repeatedly, but he talked about disclosure, and he talked about how once we started accepting that UFOs were real, it was going to change our sense of reality, because it's a lot harder to pay attention to the petty little things in your life when you realize we're not alone in the universe, and more than they're not alone. It's not like they're out there someplace where maybe we'll send a radio signal like those guys in SETI want to do or are doing. No, it's not that. They're here right now, and that's kind of a troubling concept.
Yeah.
So he's a great source, and you know what I'll do after we're done here? I'll put that full quote up on my Twitter site. And by the way, here's where people could see it. I have a site called whatifufos.com. Whatifufos.com. And on page 1, I have the entire John Lennon quote. So if people do want to see what John had to say about it, it's all there for you.
I was going to read the quote from your site, but I want the suspense. So you got to go to whatifufos.com. I'll link it in the description for ease of access.
That's great.
Awesome. Thank you for telling me that story. I love when passions collide like that.
Yeah.
Speaking of which, you're working on a new project about Betty and Barney Hill, and I recently put out a YouTube video about that case. I'm interested in myself because I think the Air Force looked into it briefly. They said there was insufficient data, but then a lot of serious doctors also looked into it, and through some hypnotherapy, amazing stories emerged that seemed to be corroborated by both witnesses independent from each other. Could you tell us about the Betty and Barney Hill
Sure.
story and what compelled you to study it?
The Betty and Barney Hill story is the granddaddy of UFO abductions cases, because it's the, even though there were a couple of reported cases prior to theirs, Antonio Villas-Boas most notably in Brazil, but the Betty and Barney case had it all. They were an interracial couple. It's 1961 in the United States. They're returning from their honeymoon, and they see what they thought was a flying saucer, and this thing starts chasing them. Now, what I've always loved about the case, and what has attracted me to it, to tell it on film, is it's full of firsts. It's the first time anybody claimed that they were abducted in a public sense in the United States. It's the first time somebody experienced missing time. It's the first time that anybody ever used hypnosis to recover these lost memories. So it's just full of firsts. So it's not like they were looking at other people's experiences with abductions and then, letting it germinate in their head into their own thing. That's why I like it. If they were making it up, they were making it up because they had vivid imaginations, not because they'd heard somebody else talk about it. And I also happen to think, and this is one of the reasons why I'm attracted to it in film, the fact that Betty and Barney were an interracial couple in 1961 is just mind-blowing. I mean, you cannot tell their story without taking that into account, even though many people have discussed it over the years, and they don't do a deep dive on that. I'm doing that in the project that we're developing. It's very much a part of it, including all the firsts. But I just find it. I'm not going to sit here and say, well, you can take to the bank that Betty and Barney Hill were abducted. I'm saying it's a pretty good case. But what's interesting in a film respect, whether it becomes a feature or a television miniseries, either expression, there are other ways to explain what happened to them. And so that gives you that sort of dramatic tension in the piece. Because Betty and Barney clearly had something happen to them, right? I mean, the binary choice has always been, well, either they were taken by aliens or they're liars. That's always been the binary choice. And I say it's not a binary choice. Right. Something happened to them. It isn't that they were liars. I can pretty well rule out that they were liars. They didn't lie about all this. But there are other explanations potentially, and that's something that's been interesting to explore. And just to complete this, the book that I have under option with my production company is called Captured, and it's the one that was written by Stanton Friedman and Kathleen Marden. And of course, Stanton Friedman, a friend of mine, sorry to see him go a couple of years ago. The sort of the dean of ufology of our time, if you will. He wrote it with Kathleen. Kathleen is the niece of Betty Hill. She was 14 years old when this thing happened, and she's a character in the film. It's just an interesting story, and the book that we have in our option has a whole lot of new information in it, and it's being updated by Kathy herself in 2020. So there'll be new details, of course. And I guess the final thing I would say is you don't make a film and pretend it's a documentary. In other words, if people really want to know more about the Betty and Barney Hill case, they need to read more about it, hear interviews with people, and maybe read Captured. I don't feel an obligation as a filmmaker to make the documentary of it. I'm making a dramatic film or series about it. And so dramatic license has to be taken into account. So does compression of characters and that kind of thing. But it's still going to be a hell of a film.
You mentioned them being an interracial couple at a time in American history when the country was extremely racially charged. This was not a time when a couple like that would necessarily want to draw attention to themselves and do something that talk about something that's already very stigmatized, UFOs. I mean, No one
It's
intends
crazy.
to.
I
Right.
mean, if you're an interracial couple, you have enough problems in your life. You know, if you're Barney Hill in 1961, every time, whether he's pumping gas at the station, uh, whether he's sitting in a diner with his wife trying to enjoy a hamburger and a milkshake, he's getting stared at. He's getting people making remarks. He's getting the look, you know, the look. And you remember in 1961, uh, black people in America in the South were being attacked by, you know, police with dogs and fire hoses, and they were being lynched. And I mean, it was a horrible time. And so the country was not real tolerant about interracial marriage at that time. The other thing that makes this time fascinating, though, is it's also the pinnacle of the Cold War, right? So at a time when the Soviets and the Americans literally in the very next year are almost going to blow the entire planet up with the Cuban Missile Crisis, Betty and Barney Hill disappear uh, with an alien abduction. You know, that's a little interesting as well. So the whole tableau of 1961 and the aftermath of it, I just find very compelling. And it's a lot easier to sort of focus on the details of their case for me anyway. I can get my head around trying to tell their story easier than I can trying to tell you whether I believe that millions and millions and millions of people have been abducted around the
Right.
world.
Right.
That's a harder one for me because you know, I, that just sounds, it still sounds outrageous to me.
Right. It sounds like also two details of the Barney and Betty Hill case that I find really interesting are that Barney described the ship, the craft, as moving silently
Yeah.
and also accelerating spontaneously and stopping spontaneously, almost like a paddle with a ball and you're hitting it and it's bouncing
Yeah.
off. Very similar to what Commander Fravor described off the coast of Southern California in 2004 off the Nimitz, the Tic Tac UFO. Definitely different size, definitely different shape. I think the Barney Betty Hill craft
Sure, it
had
is.
windows going
And it
around
looked
it,
like a
but
pancake, he said, kind of doing that thing.
right, a giant pancake. And yet the movements themselves are
Yeah.
consistent and they fit what I think Luis Elizondo put together with ATIP, the 5 observables, 2 of them being instantaneous acceleration and also silence, that these craft are operating with stealth. I think that to be able to perceive that in the 60s before, you know, there were any Navy reports of it, it's a coincidence, if not a consistency.
Well, it's interesting because you point out, so it's interesting if their experience can link to current reports. That's fascinating. And yet at the same time, you'd almost have to say, okay, if the all call has gone out that Earth is an interesting place to visit, I mean, as a theory, for example, then there doesn't have to be a singular type of UFO. There, you know, it's not like you can only be visited by one alien race or one interdimensional being or one whatever at a time. We could be uh, we could be the crossroads. We could be very interesting. People, you know, we mentioned Stanton Friedman, and I love this guy. I mean, he was so much, what a crazy, fun, knowledgeable, scientific guy, and I loved hanging out with him. Um, but I didn't agree with him on everything. And one of the things I didn't agree with him on is he, in all his lectures, would always say, who would ever want to come and visit a backwater place like the Earth where we're just all so violent and, you know, and I said, well, that almost undercuts your own argument. They're here. And they must have come for a reason. And over time, and again, I don't have proof of this theory of mine. It's just a theory. It's just my gut response. And it is that all intelligent life is interested in other intelligent life. It has something to do with cosmic loneliness or whatever, because, you know, we may be violent and we may not be deserving, but we are intelligent. And what do we want to do? We want to get out there in the universe and see what else is out there. And we'd be fascinated. We'd be fascinated if we found a bug on Mars right now. But if we found an intelligent creature someplace, it would be amazing. If we found an entire planet full of intelligent creatures that were building civilizations and planes and going to the moon and that kind of thing, I'd be very interested in them. And so I think it's possible that we're just interesting. And not that we're perfect. I'm not saying we're perfect. We're deeply, deeply flawed, but that may be why we're interesting. But I think all intelligent life wants to know about other intelligent life. And that may, in some respect, explain what we're going through.
Mm. Do you think that what Betty Hill described as the star map, the Zeta Reticula, what then looked like the map of Zeta Reticula star system, is that a coincidence? Is that an example of like real evidence? And have you looked at that in the context of other sightings at all? I know Bob Lazar mentioned that Zeta Reticula was in the briefings. He had it S4. Right. Has that come up in other places? And is there any credibility to it?
That's a tough one because it's possible that these stories are all self-referential and sort of, closing in on themselves. And it takes a lot of knowledge to sort of pull them out and look at them in a more specific way. So I don't know. The map you're talking about is when Betty was on board the craft, and this was revealed under hypnosis. She said that this leader that she got to converse with, Barney did not, but she claimed that the leader showed her, it sounds like a hologram kind of thing of a star map, that he said, these are the trade routes. This is where ships are going often, and here's where they're not going often. And we're from Zeta Reticuli, basically. And then during hypnosis, she was asked to draw this map, and she did. And, it's a nice drawing of some planets and stars, rather. And then 10 years later, supposedly a woman named Marjorie Fisher, not supposedly, she did do this. Marjorie claimed that this matched up perfectly, but that we didn't know, our own astronomers know about this. But I'm not going to tell you that's the strongest part of the case, though, because I don't think it's definitive, and I don't think in a court of law it would stand up as a powerful piece of evidence. It's an intriguing piece of the whole puzzle, but I don't put my stock in the Betty and Barney Hill case on the map. I put it on Betty and Barney Hill, and two people who, as we've talked about, had very little reason to want to seek publicity. They were already, being looked at badly by a lot of people, and the idea that they would want to add, and by the way, we went joyriding on a UFO, is not something they were looking to do. And in fact, Betty and Barney Hill did not attempt to seek publicity. Although people over the years have said, yes, the publicity found them, sort of. I mean, what they did is what you and I would probably do. I mean, if I was abducted by a UFO and I didn't want to go on CNN or Fox News and talk about it, that would be reasonable, but it doesn't mean that I wouldn't tell a close friend about it. It doesn't mean I wouldn't talk to my kids about it, or any of those. So I think what they did is they told a few people, and if I were to tell you, I got this great secret, man, and I tell you this secret, and I say, but you can't tell anybody about it, you would assure me that, of course, you're not going to tell anybody about it. And then that night, you might talk to somebody and go, I heard the craziest thing. I was interviewing this guy named Bryce Zabel, and he told me this story. But he said, I can't tell anybody about it, so don't tell anybody about it. Yep. Well, what's your friend going to do? They're going to tell. So I think that they were probably guilty of some of that, and it caught up with them, and because otherwise nobody would have heard of it. And of course, they did also file, the day after, they filed a report at Peace Air Force Base with Project Blue Book. And here's another thing that just, I find people just don't talk about it with this case, and I think they should. Peace Air Force Base, where Betty and Barney filed their report, was literally in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, which is where they were which is interesting. But what makes it profoundly interesting is Peace Air Force Base was the tip of America's nuclear spear in 1961. That's where we had all the nuclear bombers, not the missiles. They were out in North Dakota and in the Midwest. But we had all the nuclear bombers that were flying to failsafe and back at Peace Air Force Base. So I think if you're going to think about Betty and Barney being abducted or not abducted, but the fact that they were so close to the nation's only nuclear bomber base in 1961 has to be taken into account. In the same respect, by the way, that the Roswell case was America's only nuclear bomber base in 47. And in fact, those planes and that bombing capacity was moved from Roswell in the I believe the 50s and placed at Peace Air Force Base. So basically, the Betty and Barney Hill case even ties into the Roswell case through that one strange connection.
Wow. Speaking to people like Stan Friedman and Buzz Aldrin and a number of people, George Knapp, is it their understanding, based on your conversations, that nobody even at these nuclear facilities knows what this is? Because I guess there are two lines of thinking predominantly. One, that these are secret military technology that we're maybe testing in the same vicinity that we're testing nuclear type stuff. The other is that because we're testing nuclear stuff here, these unidentified things are checking it out because of what nuclear means to the planet and the universe.
My sense, just from reading and talking to some of these people like Charles Halt and others who were part of seeing these things, is that I don't think they believe that the U.S. government was testing classified materials near their bases. I mean, that's really not how you test classified materials. And it also applies to these Navy videos we've been talking about. That's really not how you test things around your own stuff and put people at risk. So I assume that most of the people who have been part of this interaction between these objects and the nuclear bases that they were at, I think they are looking for an explanation that is not as mundane, and it's not really that mundane, but it's not as mundane as the U.S. is looking at its own stuff. By the way, things keep coming out. I mean, you know, the whole Bentwater case from Britain in is it 81, I think. When it first came out, nobody admitted that base had nuclear weapons, but now we know it did. I mean, there is you know, Robert Sall is another guy that I've talked to about this. There is just a consistent interest in nuclear weapons, and probably as well there should be. I mean, if you were interested in intelligent life and you realize they were building nuclear bombs to explode on each other, that would probably be of some interest. I don't profess to understand how an alien might or might not think, but if they're here for whatever reason, the idea that nuclear weapons are part of our culture, and we're on the hairy edge of ending all life on our planet with them, seems like I'd be curious about that.
Right, I agree. Do you think there's some sort of cosmic law preventing them from interfering more overtly? Because while they do seem to show a keen interest in the nuclear weapons, they do it in a way that almost evades our knowledge and at least mass knowledge of them.
It's a valid theory. I mean, I don't think you or me or anyone has enough information to do anything other than just speculate on that. You know, it's sort of, is it the Star Trek Prime Directive? It could be, but we don't have the facts on that. That's kind of just to cycle back to where we started. It's like, what's interesting, do I think somebody knows everything? No, I don't. Do I think somebody has a better answer to your question you just asked than me? Hell yes. Of course they do. There is somebody who has read all the detailed classified reports on all of these cases and a few that you and I have never heard of and probably won't for years, that person might be able to speculate with a little more rationality than either you or me or many of the people I see speculating about it. But as a writer, as a person who has written about this topic on television and film, I would say that'd be a pretty fair speculation that I would write about. But as long as people knew I was making it, I wouldn't want to claim that I knew. I would just write about it.
Right. Where is the Air Force in all of this? What do you think is the position of the Air Force if the Navy's coming out with videos saying, we don't know what this is? Is it possible that these are top secret Air Force aircraft that they're testing against the best of the Navy technology?
I doubt it. But I will say this. When we were putting Dark Skies together, everybody assumed that we would be talking about the Air Force, that it was the Air Force. But we made Majestic 12 as an organization that the leader of it in Dark Skies was a Navy guy. And it was the Office of Naval Intelligence that was all over the UFO thing, because historically there's a lot to make that true. And this is probably not the time or the place to get into it in detail. But while Brent Friedman and I, who was my co-creator on Dark Skies, were running the show, we were approached 2 times by people who claimed they were part of the Navy, naval intelligence, and who had gained access to our program before it aired and wanted to talk to us about it. So, I mean, I have some personal experience on that. So I think that you could look. Obviously, there is competition between the services, and so your question is not out of line. I mean, there's probably, and clearly in the early days, many of those declassified memos are Air Force memos, and certainly Blue Book was an Air Force project. But I think you could make an argument now that the Navy has had a whole lot to do with the UFO topic over the years. We just didn't think about it. So you ask, where is the Air Force in it now? That is a tough question, because if they weren't involved in it, then they wouldn't have anything to say, because everything they would have known, they knew from the 40s and 50s, and then they got out of the business when they got out of Blue Book, which I don't believe. But there's no way to prove that or not. And if they were all over it, they certainly wouldn't want to get in a disclosure competition with the Navy. There may be guys at the Air Force who are looking what the Navy's doing and saying, why are they doing this? It's possible that the Air Force is as confused by the Navy disclosures as, you and I are excited by them. Right. I don't really know.
Right. I wanted to mention one thing before I forgot it, because in the beginning we were talking about sort of this tide change in the media coverage of this and just where we're at in the history of potential disclosure, maybe actually finally being on the precipice. Speaking with some of the Nimitz people and the Princeton people, and also Ralph Blumenthal, who covered ATIP, a lot of people seem to think some of these newer sightings, the 2004 sighting and the East Coast sightings off of Theodore Roosevelt in 2015, could have been a result of systems upgrades. A lot of these pilots had recently just upgraded to new, Spy 1 radar and different types of radar that could have potentially unlocked something that was maybe always there in the airspace, maybe more evasive than it now is. Do you think there's any credibility to that?
I think that's very credible. In terms of just we're able to gather more information more efficiently with higher technology, and I think that's very valid as an explanation. But I would say at the same time, let's recall, and again, going back to Dolan's books, where he just goes case after case after case after case, where you would start, where there are multiple instances of pilots who saw things, who ran their gun cameras on them to try to get information or to record it, and came back and had that film confiscated. So much like you were describing with the Nimitz. So, I mean, I think that the new technology may be making it harder for the Navy and the Air Force and militaries around the world to pretend that this isn't something that's real, because their own stuff is capturing it with more clarity and with more depth than ever before. So that probably is happening. And then, but that doesn't mean they're going to share it all with us. Obviously, there's an agenda going on here, but it's a little unclear right now exactly how that agenda lays out. So that's why I think a component of disclosure as we go into the 2020s is self-disclosure. In other words, I'd love it if the Navy would just say, and by the way, here's a hard drive with 300 gigabytes of video on it of all our best hits. And that'd be great, but they're not going to do that. But what we may have to do is, do it ourselves. We have access to far better technology as private citizens right now than anybody did in the 40s or 50s or 60s. So we are now capable of moving forward on this topic on our own. And I think that may be part of why these managers, such as they are starting to look at the layout of this particular situation a little differently and saying, well, we can either be embarrassed and reactive when an incident occurs that can't be denied, or we can try to get in front of it a little bit. And it seems clear that the Navy, anyway, has tried to get in front of it. So maybe, to go back to your Air Force question, maybe we have the aquarium versus the aviary, right? Maybe the aquarium of the Navy is interested in disclosure and the aviary of the Air Force is not, to borrow those terms, which may or not even be accurate. But what do we know about human nature? We know that we behave our institutions behave in as humanly messed up ways as we do, right? And so the fact that there's competition, the fact that there's undermining, we should expect all that in the disclosure story. Why would it be different than anything else?
Right. I saw on your Twitter account, Hollywood UFOs, that you speculated that maybe President Trump has seen the longer video
right.
of the Nimitz, that longer FLIR video that we talked about, because his official comment was, or his off-the-cuff comment, I should say, right, was hell of a video. I mean, that makes sense to me, because the FLIR video that's out, it's really, you don't see that much. It just kind of veers off at the end. But the video that Jason Turner, Gary Voorhees, and others say existed, that was 10 minutes in length, showed this thing going berserk. And if that video exists, I think that comment, hell of a video, would make more sense. So is it your belief that executive level politicians, potentially even senators and representatives in the House, could have access to some of this data that the public might not?
I don't know if it's my belief, but it's my suspicion. And I just try to apply some common sense to some of these questions. The common sense question is, if I'm a ranking member of a Senate Intelligence Committee or the President of the United States, and somebody shows me a 30-second clip from a encounter or a 2-minute clip from an encounter, what am I going to say? Is that all? And I'm going to have somebody in front of me under oath or who reports to me, and they're going to say, well, there was a longer video, and I'd say, I want you to bring that in. So just from common sense, you can't be a little bit pregnant. You can't show someone who's in charge a snippet of a video and then say, yeah, but we don't really want to show you the rest of it. So but on the other hand, listen, I'm not wild about Donald Trump being the disclosure president, if that's going to be his fate. And it may not be, but because the truth is, he doesn't speak the truth all the time. And so, for example, when he says it's a hell of a video, it's just as possible that he saw the 30-second clip on Fox News. He watched Tucker Carlson show the clip and said, hell of a video, Tucker. So I don't know that he's seen more, but I suspect that unless he's the absolute most incurious person that ever existed on the planet. And I don't think that's the knock on him particularly. If I saw a clip, I'd want to see more. And I know for sure that if I was on the Senate, any kind of Senate or House Intelligence Committee, and they brought in pilots to tell me about these things, which we know happened, I'd want to see more. And there is more. So, yeah, I think that they've seen more.
Yeah, I agree. Makes perfect sense. All right. I know we're coming up on an hour, so I'll ask you a final question. I know another project that you produced and I think wrote was the miniseries Pandemic, which
Right.
has taken on sort of newfound relevance. What's
How's it
that
ever?
experience been like?
Well, in the last decade, I guess, my wife and I were hired to write a limited television series called Pandemic, and we basically told the story of a virus that came out of Australia. We made up something called the Riptide virus. It was kind of a bird kind of flu virus, but we told it through the point of view of Los Angeles through an ensemble of characters, all of whom were affected and impacted by either the medical part of the virus or the shutdown part of the virus. So in our series, we postulated that LA, they tried to lock it down. They literally closed down the freeways in and out of the city to try to lock it down. We must have done something right. We won the Writers Guild of America award for it, so we were very happy about that. But we never thought about it again. It wasn't widely seen. I mean, it was sort of seen, but it wasn't seen as much as that feature film Contagion, done by Soderbergh, was seen. But, you know, we were happy and we got paid and we went on with our lives. And then along comes the coronavirus, and suddenly we're seeing that Pandemic is being featured on Amazon and getting all kinds of comments and reviews. And then we saw it pop up on Google, where literally it had like something like 10 million views the first time I even knew it was on Google. And it was just crazy. I went to bed one night, wrote down the number of views, got up like 6 hours later, and 27,000 more people had seen it.
That's crazy.
And it was just nuts. And then the thing that just goes to show you how America can market any damn thing that we want. The title of the film was Pandemic, but on Google, they were now marketing it as Pandemic: a coronavirus movie, so that it, got more people to watch it. Anyway, it was interesting to see that happen. You really do see the impact. Which is why I've never underestimated my UFO work, right. Because if often what you talk about, as a writer, you're trying to bring these ideas into your head and see and kick them around and see how they taste and see what you think would be the right expression of it. So, while we didn't predict the coronavirus, we did predict, for example, that they were storing bodies on an ice skating rink, right? And then 10 years later, Spain is doing that, right? And we're freaking out. Oh my God, how did we even, come up with that? So I think that there may be some of that, where the past is prologue, and some of this work I've been lucky enough to work on. Well, the first UFO project I ever had produced was something called Official Denial, and it was the first original film on the Sci-Fi Channel. And it was about an abduction, but with a twist. The abductee, the government actually knew this abductee was being abducted, so they didn't have any trouble believing him. And they knew that these abductions happened more than once, so they wired his house up as kind of a tripwire if an abduction happened again. And then when he was being abducted a second time, it tripped Operation Forced Encounter, and we tried to shoot down this UFO, and they did, and they got a creature, and nobody could talk to it, but the guy that was abducted became the guy that tried to talk to it. That's kind of the story. But, and this is the interesting thing, this will be something to postulate, this was made in 1993, and the thing that I put in for the twist is somebody at the end goes, well, where are they from? And the guy says, it's not where, it's when. because it turned out that they were us from the future. Now, to the best of my knowledge, maybe someone else floated that earlier. I don't know, but this was 93. I never saw anything about it. I think it was one of the first times anybody ever talked about it. And, you know, as we talk about who are they extraterrestrial? Are they interdimensional? It's also possible that it has something to do with us, which would potentially explain some of this nuclear stuff we're talking about.
Mm. You're not the first person to suggest it, but that makes a whole lot of sense in the way you frame it, because why would we want to let us destroy ourselves?
Right. But I mean, it was certainly new in 93, because I remember meetings that we had and people like, what, are you crazy? They're aliens. And I was like, yeah, but what if they're not aliens? What if they're from some other place, or they're us? And that was interesting.
Well, to the best of my knowledge, there's no proof at all, or even evidence that's compelling at all, of them being aliens that I know of.
I agree.
There's a ton that it's physics-defying technology that no foreign government or private contractor has been able to produce over decades, and it's existed here for decades.
I think you're right. I think the where I've come down on it, and I've come down on this slowly over time, but I think the least likely explanation for the Navy videos and anything before was that somebody here on Earth made them. Okay, so I think it is more of an esoteric thing. It's either something that has to do with our sense of reality not being what we think it is, which is, you know, is so mind-blowing that it's hard to get your own brain wrapped around that one. I think the most likely possibility is extraterrestrial. I think interdimensional is sort of a subset of extraterrestrial. And that's possible. And then I also think, you know, time travel is possible. But, you know, there's evidence that these things have been around for a while. And then that's the question. Why? What are they doing? And why is it that we pretend they don't exist? Why do we do that?
The part that's hard to wrap your mind around that you touched on, could that be, have you considered all this simulation theory that, given the potential to create artificial intelligence and simulated realities, artificial realities that are almost indiscernible from reality, we're almost there right now with where games have gotten, how quickly they've evolved. If that technology is possible, it's inevitably happened somewhere. And if it's happened, then what are the odds that we're not living in some simulated reality like that, and that this is the one true reality?
Yeah.
Could these have to do with that in some way?
I mean,
those are
my friend, we're deep into the speculation zone right now with that one. And part of the problem about analyzing it is that if you were actually a character in the simulation, you would not know it. Mm-hmm. I tend to think. But to be honest with you, it just doesn't feel right to me. I mean, I feel physical to me, right? Yeah. I just, and I know, I understand all the arguments that can be made, but that one just doesn't seem right to me. Now, is it a great idea? Would I write a movie about that? Hell yes, I would do that, you know, in a second. But do I think it's actually the one? Probably not.
All right. Anything else you want to plug? I'm going to put your website, whatifufos.com, in the description. I'm going to put your Twitter handle, Hollywood UFOs, in the description. We'll also track down a few of the other things we talked about.
Well, I don't want to plug anything because you've done it adequately, and so have I, and I appreciate that. And I encourage anyone who's listening to come join the conversation that I'm trying to have on this topic. But what I would like to say to people is really, this is a golden moment in history. And I know it's hard to look at that because we're in the middle of the coronavirus and we're still so partisan, divided on how to even deal with that. And life seems kind of odd and ugly sometimes. But I do think it is worth all of us paying some attention to the fact that we're on the cusp of some clarity, or at least increasing information on this topic of whether UAP or UFOs are in fact something extraordinary. And I think that the evidence suggests that they are. And so what I want to encourage people to do is to feel free to start talking about it to other people. Don't judge people who talk about it. Be one of the people that talks about it. Try to get a little bit informed so that you can be somebody at the dinner party when people say, well, you don't really believe in that, do you? And you can say, well, actually, I do. And they say, well, why? What? And you say, well, let me give you a few examples. I think we all have to bring our activism and our activist voices to the fray right now. This is what, certain times demand certain behavior, and that's what our times, I think, are demanding of us right now.
I couldn't agree more. Well, thank you, Bryce, for going against the fray at times when this wasn't such a popular topic and it wasn't as credible in the minds of many as it is now, and continuing to this day to be a strong voice and advocate for it. I know
it's completely my pleasure, Brian, and thank you for having me on. And thanks to all the people who have watched this long and got to the end. Thanks a lot, guys.
There will be some, amazingly there will. And it's more for you than me. So thanks again, Bryce.
Take care.
You too.